Global cooperation is a concept that has been mentioned a lot in many of the international meetings that have been taking place in the first part of 2020. The concept has been mostly associated to strategies to fight the coronavirus. But the pandemic has also brought to light how interconnected we are on a global scale. So international cooperation is now mentioned as the solution to solve many of the international crises we are facing today.
In a previous video, we saw American Vice President Al Gore was inviting governments and corporations to take this opportunity to continue the collaboration on issues related to climate change.
Before that, right in the middle of the pandemic and during an online business event organized by IBM, it was Amal Clooney that reminded us that global cooperation is necessary to solve also other international crises, and that includes mass killings in Syria, humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen, genocide in Myanmar, for example. The world's powers, and the United States in particular, are not doing enough to stop these catastrophes or to bring to justice the people who are responsible for these crises.
As the Washington Post's tagline says, democracy dies in darkness, and if you silence the press, it gets very dark and very quiet. Because of this, I have focused in my legal practice on defending journalists who are prosecuted simply for doing their job.
The journalists that Amal Clooney and her firm defended included Maria Ressa, a CNN anchor in Asia who also published a newsletter. In her articles, she wrote about corruption, and she was an outspoken critic of Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte. She was denounced, arrested, and facing over 100 years in prison. She also defended two Reuters journalists, accused of spying. They were sentenced to 7 years in prison after they reported a massacre in a small village in Myanmar. And a reporter for Al Jazeera that was incarcerated after being accused of spreading fake news about instability in Egypt.
There are hundreds of cases like Maria's playing out in courts around the globe every year. Trials designed to silence, if the government can get away with it. I'm happy to say that each of these journalists has now been released and is back at work. But many more are not so lucky. Unfortunately, in the COVID era, the threat to journalists has only increased. Authoritarian governments have capitalized on the moment to take even more draconian measures to suppress the truth. And this virus shows that it is not only lethal to democratic rule, this can also be deadly to individuals.
Journalists are not the only victims. Dr. Li was the first to alert his colleagues in a hospital in Wuhan about a new deadly virus, but he was accused by Chinese authorities of disturbing the public order, and was forced to confess that he made false statements. He died 6 weeks later, for complications due to the coronavirus.
Dr. Li could have saved lives, maybe saved his own life, if he had not been silent. Many governments have introduced or expanded laws that criminalize so-called fake news on the pandemic, with the government conveniently being the one to define what is fake. This is happening even in Europe, even in democracies.
The countries where authorities have introduced laws that limit the freedom of the press during the pandemic include Hungary, Singapore, India. Here the authorities have introduced so-called fake news laws that basically restrict or criminalize content that can spread false or distorted facts that might agitate the public.
Journalists in the United States are also considered under threat, as they have been called enemy of the people by the president, who also berates them when they ask inconvenient questions.
This moment reminds us that rights we take for granted, like privacy and freedom of movement, can be lost overnight. Free speech is also on the line. And as truthful speech is suppressed, misinformation fueled by social media is amplified. Telling people that corona is caused by 5G phone networks, that holding their breath can cure it, or that vaccines are more dangerous than the virus. So the need to hear the truth is more urgent than ever, and the current assault on truth must be met with an equally determined response.
Most of the time, Amal Clooney makes the news during her public appearances with her husband and Hollywood star George Clooney. What we don't see often, instead, are the humanitarian causes she takes on as international human rights lawyer, and the risks that she and her partners, including her husband, are exposed to. For example, Amal and her firm have defended Iraqi Yazidi Nadia Murad, a young woman who witnessed and suffered the atrocities inflicted by ISIS to the Yazidis, but was able to escape after being held as a slave. Her story was told to the world. She became an activist and won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2018. But the people responsible for those atrocities have not been punished yet. Amal Clooney is working to bring the people responsible for those crimes in front of an international court.
In my work too, I try to galvanize global cooperation to respond to global threats to human rights. Let me provide just one example. In the last 4 years, I've represented a group of young women from Iraq who were kidnapped and held as sex slaves by ISIS, perhaps the most global terrorist group the world has ever known. More than 40,000 foreign fighters from 110 countries are estimated to have joined ISIS's ranks. This international army attacked more than 25 cities around the globe, including London, Paris, and New York. But did global powers rally to bring ISIS leaders to justice and give their victims their day in court? They did not. But there has been no international effort to create a court to put ISIS on trial. No coordination between governments to make justice a priority. Local trials in the region have been inadequate, and thousands of fighters remain at large or held without charge in camps.
According to Amal Clooney, the United States should lead global justice efforts against international crimes, just like they did when they prosecuted the Nazis or when they brought to court the generals responsible for the genocide in Bosnia. The U.S., instead, seems to turn to the opposite direction.
But today, the U.S. government says the International Criminal Court is, quote, dead to us. The U.S. visa of the court's prosecutor has been revoked, and the U.S. has issued a warning that those who support the court's investigations can be denied entry to the United States, have their assets frozen, and even face arrest. So we continue our fight for international trials, so that victims can look their abuser in the eye and tell the world what was done, so that there is a counter-narrative to ISIS propaganda, so that history will not forget.
Amal and George established the Clooney Foundation for Justice in 2016 to advance justice in courtrooms, communities, and classrooms around the world. Microsoft, Columbia Law School, the American Bar Association, and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights are also partners of the foundation. There are different programs within the foundation. Trial Watch focuses on human rights violations in trials around the world. The Sentry investigates, denounces, and fights corruption, violence, and human rights abuses in conflict zones in Africa, in particular South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the Central African Republic. The docket is similar in scope to the Sentry, but it targets individuals and corporations that are complicit in international crimes, not just in African regions, but worldwide.
No country can alone be the world's policeman, but this pandemic reminds us that we have a better chance of finding solutions to global challenges, whether in health or human rights, if leaders around the globe can work together, and such global cooperation should be led, not subverted, by the United States, where we feel an empathy for one another, regardless of color, gender, sexuality, geography, or creed, where the best talent in the world can be pooled together, where public-private partnerships are a model for positive change, where we all feel engaged. A Canadian Supreme Court judge once said that what matters is not what you stand for, but what you stand up for. We are confronting an invisible enemy that has triggered the gravest health crisis of our lifetimes. Like the human rights crisis, no individual or government can solve it alone. But when we look back at this moment in years to come, when our children ask us, "What did you do?" we should say that we stood up for one another and that each of us played our part.